Opposition.
After 9 years, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the homelessness and hunger. He doubled the debt, increased taxes, and caused inflation, but said it was all to fund generous programs that would end homelessness. Well, homelessness is now up 38%, and a quarter of Canadians are skipping meals because they can't afford them. That's because his greedy government is consuming everything Canadians earn. Why is the NDP and Liberals forcing Canadians to feed this morbidly obese government instead of feeding their families?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, we will take no lessons from the Conservatives who purport to care about poverty and Canadians when every single time they vote against those supports, $10 a day childcare, early learning and childhood education. They're not supporting our budgetary measures to put food in school lunchboxes for 400,000 children, Mr. Speaker. It's unbelievable that they will at one hand say they support Canadians and on the other hand vote against those supports every single time. Thank you, Mr.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I'm grateful that the member points out that we have voted against every single policy that has caused homelessness to rise by 38%. Right. We have voted against every single inflationary policy that has forced 1/4 of Canadians to skip meals because they can't afford a meal on their table. Mr. Speaker, the government has doubled the debt, increased inflation, and blocked home building. Why is it that they force Canadians to feed this morbidly obese government rather than feeding their families?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, our government is actually focused on keeping inflation low so that interest rates can come down. And I will note that inflation has come down below the targeted range of 3%. And at the same time, Mr. Speaker, we have Budget 2024. We have supports for renters. We have supports for affordable housing. We have a national school food program on the table, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to support Canadians with dental, with early childhood education, all the while the Conservatives vote against. Mr. Speaker, there's no plan on that side of the House. We will support.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
She repeats the same costly promises the Prime Minister has been breaking for 9 years. Mr. Speaker, in a 6-week period, 50 homeless encampments have opened in Toronto. Let that sink in. There are a total of 256 tent cities in Toronto alone.
Oh my goodness.
It wasn't like this before this Prime Minister, and it won't be like this after he's gone. Will he admit that everything is broken after 9 years of his government?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, when that member was a minister and had responsibility for housing, that there were more than 2 million more Canadians living in poverty. And the number of times that he talked about vulnerable people or taking action to help homeless, 0. He wants to hold out to people in a time of difficulty across the world that the solution is to cut the programs they need, to take away dental care, to take away pharmacare, and shame on him for it. We will stand up for vulnerable people in a way he never has.
The Honourable Member from Leeds Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
At his billion-dollar green slush fund, the Prime Minister's hand-picked chair is being investigated for lining her own pockets and resigned in disgrace. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, this Prime Minister clearly isn't worth the cost or that corruption. But another NDP Liberal appointed director has been caught funneling $42 million to companies that she has stakes in. The Liberals knew it, but then they promoted her to the infrastructure bank anyway. But wait, she suddenly resigned. They gave her keys to a bigger mansion after burglaring the first one. Will they investigate every dollar she handed out?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation and Science.
Mr. Speaker, not your
we're seeing the Conservative Party of Canada going after any company, Mr. Speaker, that will work against climate change in this country. That's what these Conservatives are about, Mr. Speaker. Behind these questions, they're against new technology to help fight climate change. They know very well, and I've said it many times in this House, the moment we heard about delegation, we launched an investigation. The chair has resigned, the CEO has resigned. We are investigating. We're going to make sure that every dollar, Mr. Speaker, that is spent is going to be well spent. We're going to restore governance, we're going to restore confidence, and we're going to keep investing in Canadian companies, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Leeds Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
It's really too late that we only see the minister get animated after they get caught. Speaker, the NDP Liberal appointed chair and another director were caught stuffing their pockets full of taxpayer cash. They got caught, they resigned, they're being investigated, but then a third one who was found to be furthering her own interests was then appointed to the infrastructure bank, but suddenly resigned, much to the surprise of the minister responsible. This is life after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government. They have no idea where the money is going. We need to protect Canadian tax dollars. Will they call in the RCMP to investigate?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, that's the same question he just asked and that the minister just answered. But while we're here and have some time, Mr. Speaker, I want to know why there is a woman in Aurora named Sabrina Maddow and another one, and they're both women, by the way. Her name is Rachel Gilliland, alleging things that don't seem quite kosher in Conservative nomination land. And that is after the accusations by Ms. Maddow of illegality in the Conservative nomination, and they just happen to be the only two women in that nomination race. Why?
Order. I know that all honourable members, all ministers. Order. I know that all members and especially all ministers understand that, of course, that when questions are asked, it should be about the administration of the government or the committees. And it's the same thing which is expected of ministers to respond to the administration of government. The honourable member from Vancouver Quadra. Oh, excuse me, I've made a mistake. The honourable member from St. Albert, Edmonton.
Speaker, after the Prime Minister got caught turning a blind eye to Beijing's interference in our elections, his government was dragged kicking and screaming into calling a public inquiry. It has now been revealed that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet are obstructing the work of the inquiry by refusing to turn over documents to the Commissioner. A simple question: will the Prime Minister end the obstruction and turn over all documents requested by Madam Justice Hogue, unredacted, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister for Public Security.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend knows very well that there's no obstruction at all. He should have a word with his House Leader, with whom I worked very collaboratively all summer in setting up the Hogg Commission. We agreed to all the details of the terms of reference, including the fact that solicitor-client privilege and cabinet confidence were essential things that needed to be protected. And, of course, the people that served in Mr. Harper's government would know the attachment Mr. Harper had to those principles. But our government went a step further and made available cabinet documents that were relevant to this inquiry, and will continue to do everything necessary to allow them to do their work.
Hear, hear.
And now, the honourable member from Thornhill.
A hat trick for the Prime Minister, but not the good type. 3 reports released in just one day paint a devastating picture of life in Canada after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government. Food Banks Canada, the Salvation Army, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer all say there is more homelessness and there is more hunger. They kept telling us that they're spending our money for our own good, and everything is fine, and it's not their fault. Mr. Speaker, it's been 9 years. Right. Whose fault is it?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, grocery price inflation is coming down. 1.4% in April, down from 1.9% a month before. This is encouraging news, certainly for Canadians, but it's important to know that our government put forward the most comprehensive package of competition reforms in Canadian history. Why? Because more competition equals better prices. But it's a bit rich for the Conservatives to point to food bank lineups when they oppose a national school food program that's going to feed over 400,000 kids across Canada.
The honourable member from Thornhill.
And 9 years later, it hasn't fed a single child. They just don't get it. The very policies that they have delivered has given us the worst quality of life in half a century, the worst since the last Trudeau ran this place. In the past 3 months, 25% of young adults have had to go to a food bank in this country, 38% more homelessness after they promised to end it, and about 50% of Canadians are worse off this year than they were last year. How does this government have so much money to spare while ordinary Canadians are literally going hungry and homeless?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Quite the statement from the Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party. My advice to her is to actually read the report from the Parliamentary Budget Officer. In that report, she will see that no less than 50,000 Canadians are supported by the National Housing Strategy, specifically the Reaching Home program that they would cut. We know they champion an austerity agenda. This also from the Deputy Leader, who made clear only a few weeks ago on a yacht, no less, Mr. Speaker, that less homes have to be built in Canada. They're siding with the NIMBYs. We want to build more homes, including for the most vulnerable of this country, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member South Shore, St. Margaret's.
Well, let's take a look at the record that they are so proud of. The results: homeless in Halifax have grown from 284 in 2015 to over 1,200 now. The housing minister gave taxpayer money to Halifax to hire 30 more gatekeeper bureaucrats. After 9 years, the NDP Liberal Prime Minister, there are now over 30 homelessness encampments in Halifax. Again, will the Liberals use common sense and realize that funding gatekeepers does not build homes?
Yeah.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I point him to the so-called housing plan of the Leader of the Opposition, which says nothing about homelessness. So they can talk about this, but we know how serious they are. They're not serious at all. The gatekeepers that he talks about in this case are really municipal officials, mayors and councillors, for example, and others, who have seen in Halifax, in London, Ontario, in Brampton, across the country, 170 plus communities who understand that zoning changes are fundamental to getting more homes built. Missing middle housing, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, fourplexes, duplexes, triplexes, all of that is made possible, and they're against it, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, what an incredibly all-encompassing and comprehensive non-answer that was from the member. Mr. Speaker, just a couple of months ago, I visited the food bank in Oromocto, New Brunswick. Oromocto is home to Base Gagetown, Canada's largest military base. We were shocked when we discovered from the director of the food bank there that they serve upwards of 50 service military members and their families. That's 1 out of every 10 clients they serve. Mr. Speaker, our brave men and women deserve better, and they are asking for this government to do the right thing. It's not more than what they can give right now. Why don't they start by axing the tax and getting off their backs?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, I marvel at the temerity of a person who would stand in this House and vote against a pay raise, a well-earned pay raise for every member of the Canadian Armed Forces, and vote against that pay raise and then stand up and pretend that they actually care about the men and women who serve our forces.
The Honourable Member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Mr. Speaker, maybe that minister needs to fight for Canadians by actually listening to them and talking to them. Because after 9 years of that Liberal NDP Prime Minister, things have never been worse. Canadians are more hungry and they're homeless. The Parliamentary Budget Officer confirmed what most Canadians already know, which is homelessness has increased 38% despite them promising to end it. But wait, it gets worse. From the front page of the Toronto Star, City to prioritize larger homeless encampments in new strategy as number of tents cities grow citywide. When did the Prime Minister simply give up and say, you know what, a tent is good enough?
The Honourable Minister for Children, for Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've said it again. Once again, we hear the Conservatives stand in this House and profess their support for Canadians. But I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that's not what we see day after day. When we put forward measures like the National School Food Program to ensure 400,000 more children have access to food at school, what do we see, Mr. Speaker? The Conservatives vote against. We put forward the Canada Child Benefit. What do we see, Mr. Speaker? They vote against. We will fight for...
The Honourable Member from...
After 9 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost, with a 38% increase in homelessness and 1/4 of Canadians skipping meals because of a lack of money. The Bloc voted for $500 billion in centralizing and inflationary spending to add to the another 100,000 public servants and doubling consulting spending. They said they had no choice because the government was going to shut down otherwise. Can the government inform the Bloc that this spending would have been adopted with the NDP regardless of how the Bloc voted?